Good evening. Thank you. And welcome to the Bard Graduate Center. My name is Josh Massey, and I'm a second-year master's student here at BGC. If this is your first time here, welcome. And Bard Graduate Center is a research institute that studies the human past through its objects. In our master's and PhD courses, gallery exhibitions, and public humanities and research programs, we aim to foster new ways of understanding the world around us through the transdisciplinary study of things across space and time. That is why we are all here together tonight. Earlier this year, in a tutorial with my colleague Jeffrey Collins, I read a book called The Shape of Time, Remarks on the History of Things, which was written by an art historian from Yale University named George Kubler in 1962. It's a rather slender book, but it's rather dense and at times incredibly frustrating. And for 60 years, it's been considered a cult classic of sorts, popular among scholars of the material world and contemporary artists from Robert Smithson to Sheila Hicks. In his book, Kubler argues that histories of objects, everything from priceless works of art to cheap knickknacks, focus too much on intangible ideas like meaning and style and ignore what's right in front of them, mainly the form of objects themselves. Instead of a linear history in which the Baroque gives way to the Rococo, which in turn gives way to the neoclassical, and so on, Kubler proposes a history of objects as a sequence of forms. These forms, think of cups, or chairs, or forks, or ceilings, he writes, change as the social, cultural, political, and material contexts in which they emerge change. This system, Kubler believes, allows us to study objects across space, time, and material. It simultaneously opens up the ways of engaging with old, mainly European, things while bringing previously ignored or unknown things from the global south and other exploited or colonized parts of the world into historical discourses. In conversation with Jeffrey, I remarked that The Shape of Time was turning 60 this year and that we should have a birthday party for it. Although I was joking about the birthday party for Kubler's book, perhaps I was just looking for an excuse to eat birthday cake and have balloons, I soon realized that reading The Shape of Time challenged the ways I thought about objects in history. And so, Jeffrey and I invited 4 members of the BGC faculty to share their readings of this book. Each approaches objects from different disciplines. Meredith Linn is a historical archaeologist studying Irish immigrant and African American communities in 19th century New York City. François Louis is a historian studying the art and material culture of the Khitan Liao dynasty in northern China. Aaron Glass is an anthropologist studying First Nations visual art and material culture, media, and performance on the northwest coast of North America. And Drew Thompson is a historian studying African American, and Black diaspora visual and material culture, histories of photography, and Black modernism. Each was asked to read The Shape of Time and respond to the book as they see fit, approaching the text from their specific fields of study. The only catch was that they could not talk to each other about how they were planning to approach the text. They don't know what they're going to say. Jeffrey and I don't either. So it should be hopefully a good surprise for us all. After the presentations, Jeffrey and I will moderate a Q&A between each of the faculty members, and then that will be followed by a reception on the 6th floor. So with that, I'd like to invite Meredith Linn up to the podium, and thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Jeffrey, for the kind invitation to be part of this event, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. As the first member of tonight's panel to make some remarks upon George Kubler's remarks on the history of things, I thought it might be helpful to sketch out some of what I think might be the primary aims of this book and highlight a couple of ideas that I found to be particularly compelling and applicable to our studies here at BGC today, with the caveats that the text is new to me, that I approach it as an anthropologically trained historical archaeologist who sees culture as a fundamental part to any study of the past, and that I have only a limited grasp of the scholarly debates in art history 60 years ago in which Kubler was intervening. So, in The Shape of Time, George Kubler, then a professor of art history at Yale University and the leading scholar of architecture in colonial Mexico. Sorry, can you hear me? Am I close enough? Okay. as well as an emerging specialist in pre-Columbian art, presented his ideas about a new way to study things, especially art objects. Kubler framed his ideas as diverging significantly from the prevailing modes of analysis in art history at the time he was writing his book in the late 1950s. In a nutshell, he critiqued the biographical approach, stylistic periodization, and iconology, each of which I'll unpack briefly, because at least for me, having some understanding of what Kubler was writing against is helpful for understanding his contributions and what needs he felt they could address. So, first, Kubler rejected the study of biographies of artists as the prime way to explain works of art. This model originated in antiquity and was revived and expanded in the 16th century by Giorgio Vasari in his book Lives of the Artists, which has been important ever since. Vasari detailed the biographies of the most excellent Italian painters, sculptors, and architects from the 13th through the 16th century, and largely attributed great works of art to inborn genius. Kubler rejected this idea, countering that there are important factors besides innate talent that enabled artists to produce extraordinary works of art, a point I'll return to later. Kubler also critiqued stylistic periodization as both arbitrary and not fine-grained enough to capture the complexity within individual artworks, not to mention the myriad forms that coexist within a single historical time span. He was particularly critical of the so-called Baroque style, defined by Heinrich Wölfflin in the late 19th century on the basis of a handful of formal oppositions. Kubler asserted that the Baroque style could not adequately account for regional variations, likely those he grappled with firsthand in his own studies of colonial Mexican architecture. These critiques of biography and style made some good sense to me as an outsider, but Kubler also turned away from iconology, the interpretation of symbolic meanings of works of art within their cultural and historical contexts, developed by A.B. Warburg and most associated with Erwin Panofsky and his study of Renaissance art. Kubler, in contrast, suggested that art historians, and in fact scholars of any kind studying any objects, should place renewed emphasis on form, asserting that art stands outside culture and responds to laws of its own. And here's one of the places where I became somewhat confused. Why would anyone want to reject a search for meaning in objects or throw out cultural context? And is such an endeavor even possible? And also, trying to establish laws to predict anything related to human behavior or productions today seems risky at best, though it was popular in many fields in the 1960s. So feeling a little dismayed and lost, I did what any good scholar should do and headed to the endnotes, hoping for some additional clarity that I wasn't finding in the main text. There, Kubler's first endnote referenced anthropologists Anna Hardwick Gayton and Alfred Kroeber's 1927 study of a collection of Nazca pottery as one of the primary inspirations for this book. And this seemed to me to be a promising lead. The collection Gayton and Kroeber studied lacked many details about the archaeological context in which the artifacts had been excavated by the early German archaeologist Max Uhle from sites associated with the pre-contact Nazca culture in Peru, known now especially for its polychrome pottery, textiles, and large-scale geoglyphs. So you see pottery and a geoglyph here. So in order to understand when the collection of ceramics they were looking at were made, the authors analyzed the forms, designs, and colors of each vessel in the collection, with the goal of placing them into a relative chronological sequence that the authors ordered by relative complexity. They then compared their results with another collection of ceramics with known provenience and found that their order, again, based on formal qualities, matched. So such formal typologies were not new to archaeology. Establishing them was and still is an essential starting point before any other questions can be asked of the cultures that left them behind. In the absence of detectable traces of a known and dated event like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius or the fall of Troy, or without the application of scientific absolute dating methods such as carbon-14, which wasn't developed until 1949, the main way to date stratigraphic layers at any archaeological site was by artifact typologies. Typologies of ceramic vessels were, and again still are, especially well used because of the ubiquity of ceramics, how they intersect with cultural aesthetics, and their survival in archaeological contexts. So in a sense, archaeologists have long used objects, and ceramics especially, to tell time. So Kubler's interest in ceramic typologies seemed to be on relatable ground to me. But reading more carefully, it became clear that using objects to date a site or to tell historical time was not what Kubler found so interesting about Gayton and Kroeber's analysis. What he found interesting was something else that's also essential to archaeological projects and to our study of objects here at BGC, and that is, how can we extract information from objects without recourse to or in the absence of supporting historical documents, without oral histories or time machines, or extending Kubler's compelling metaphor of historian as stargazer without spaceships to travel to distant past stars. The formal changes that Gayton and Kroeber observed in this unprovenience pottery of this ancient culture that left no written texts, such as the transformation, I meant to show you this. This is what Gayton and Kroeber were looking at in terms of shapes and designs and colors, and there's a lot of these illustrations and graphs, and they use statistical methods, and it's a complicated study that's available online should you wish to pursue it further. But what Kubler was really interested in was these kinds of observations that Gayton and Kroeber made about how shapes and in this case motifs transformed over time. And so this kind of formal transformation inspired Kubler to look both to the past of his own discipline to revive an interest in form, and outwards towards ideas in other fields, especially linguistics and mathematics, but expressively not biological models, which is interesting, to generate the approach he presented in The Shape of Time. Kubler thus focused The Shape of Time upon contemplating formal transformations in all kinds of objects, from tools to art. And the way that he kind of distinguishes those two categories is problematic, but in my view, but we'll leave it at that. So he's looking at not just art objects, even though that really is his focus. He makes a lot of references to ordinary objects, tools, and so on. So he's interested in these formal transformations and the new avenues of thought that such contemplation reveals. He argued that objects of any kind are examples in a sequence of like objects that originated with an initial invention of the object class, what he called the prime object. A prime object, he felt, was something that was sort of innovative and created to respond to human needs. In Kubler's view, prime objects are replicated by subsequent objects that hew closely to the original or slowly drift away until they no longer meet the need for which the prime object was designed, and the sequence is arrested. Sometimes that sequence is reactivated at a later date, or sometimes a sequence merges with another, or sometimes there might be a mutation in the sequence, and an object that's different enough from the others in the sequence becomes a new prime object and establishes a new sequence. Did you get that? So maybe a visual might help. Again, from the footnotes. So Kubler noted that these sequences, of these prime objects that are then replicated by objects that are alike to a certain extent, could be represented like a directed graph in mathematical studies, like the one shown here. Each arrow of the graph represents a sequence. And then within each sequence, Kubler described a network or mesh of subordinate traits that in long section has fiber-like structure. So we might visualize each of these arrows in cross-section, each of these arrows more like fabric fibers or the fiber optic cables of the 21st century. So there are many thought-provoking ideas about sequences and other aspects of things in The Shape of Things, though some of which, in my opinion, as a new reader from a different field, are unfortunately buried within a text that's often frustratingly difficult to read, contradictory, and deeply Eurocentric. But in my remaining time, I hope to briefly excavate two of Kubler's ideas that I feel remain insightful for us at BGC today. First, Kubler proposes that the artist's position or timing within a sequence, rather than only their position in absolute time or elements of their own biography, is an important factor that affects their chances of producing an extraordinary thing. Kubler suggests that the best timing is later in a sequence, when enough variety has been introduced for the artist to learn from, but not too late, such that all the interesting potential innovations have already been explored by others. Similarly, he suggests that exposure to ideas of quote-unquote rival artists and to collections of objects that are part of other sequences is also critical. And the latter effectively makes an argument for the importance of museums and collections, and how studying past things can help humans to innovate new things that can address new needs in the present and the future. And second, Kubler hints here and there in his text in a kind of early nod to what later scholars such as Alfred Gell would call object agency, that things themselves might have a kind of power to inspire innovation. Kubler proposed that once a sequence is established, the form of the thing has a kind of gravitational pull that exerts power over the creation of new objects. He writes, quote, it is as if things generated other things in their own images by human intermediaries, end quote. This I find to be another compelling idea, that things themselves might in some sense come to the aid of humans to help us solve our myriad present-day needs and problems. So in summary, despite some critiques that I have and I expect my colleagues share of the shape of time, some of which are at least partly a result of the biases of Kubler's own time, this book remains one that contains ideas that are inspiring and resonant for us in the present 60 years later. Thank you. And now I invite my colleague, François Louis, to the podium. Oh.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Move this a little bit over. Thank you, Meredith. That was very informative. I didn't read the book in light of its historical context. I just read it without actually barely even looking at the footnotes. And I should probably have done that. I've never read Kubler's book before, and I've actually also never come across anyone who was recommending that I read it until Jeffrey Collins did that this summer. And the question he wanted to ponder was, is Kubler's 1962 book still relevant today? And in particular, how relevant is it for the study of the history of things? Given its subtitle, Remarks on the History of Things, I anticipated this book to be some sort of discussion of material culture. And having read it, I realized that the subtitle simply answers the ominous claim in the main title. Time is perceivable as the history of things. Indeed, as material manifestations of events, things are all categories. Things of all categories are the shapes of time, be they stars or paintings or whatever you have you. Kubler's preferred category of things are art and architecture. Understanding artworks as expressions of culture is definitely not his concern. Indeed, he is explicitly critical of art historical methods and takes a cultural approach and art historical methods that take a cultural approach and are looking for meaning beyond formalism, such as structural analysis, which I guess was the Vienna School system, or iconology that comes out of Panofsky's lead. And I too had a hard time understanding some of Kubler's writing. Let me give you an example, which is actually uh, already much clearer now that Meredith has honed in onto the exact same passage. Um, Kubler gives a description on the flow of time. A quote, "We can imagine the flow of time as assuming the shapes of fibrous bundles, with each fiber corresponding to a need upon a particular theater of action, and the length of fibers varying as to the duration of each need and the solution of its problems. The cultural bundles therefore consist of variegated fibrous lengths of happening, mostly long and many brief. They are juxtaposed largely by chance and rarely by conscious forethought and rigorous planning." I literally cannot understand what he's talking about. And he's introducing these concepts of need, of fibrous bundles, for the first time in this passage, which appears really actually very much to the end of the book. So I find these ruminations of his very unproductive. But writing style aside, Kubler provides a philosophy-based, top-down reading of art history that remains very much in general terms. Instead of analyzing the formal qualities of individual artworks, I think Kubler thinks in much broader, well-accepted categories such as Western art or Asian art or ancient Greek sculpture, Gothic architecture, colonial architecture. As a result, he has no need for illustrations. And although he emphasizes a non-symbolic formal reading of art, he rejects the notions of style. He proposes to replace style with the notion of prime objects and replications, which are ordered in form sequences. Meredith has already explained that to you, and maybe my other colleagues will no, do that again. But these prime objects are rare masterpieces, at least that's how I understood him. Masterpieces marking moments of significant invention, while the mass of related works are replicas, mere replicas. To me, the idea of derivatives and replicas suggests a rejection of artistic agency. I would propose that every art object is designed to some degree with a conscious mind of an artist, and is not just a replica. I mean, how can everything be a replica except for a few prime objects? The concept of style is certainly imprecise and overused, but it is the best. It is at its best something that allows art historians to engage with artistic intention. It also allows to propose dating sequences by comparing a range of design features. In fact, style remains a fundamental concept in the history of art because it offers a useful way of talking in comparisons. When we are talking about regional style, for instance, we're comparing formal features of different regions. The same is true when looking at period, personal, or workshop styles. I do not see how locating an elusive prime object in the historical form sequence engages with artistic agency in the same way. Although Meredith did find some way through that. What about the relevance of Kubler's ideas for decorative arts, design, and material culture? What about its relevance to studying objects in light of manufacture, race, class, status, gender, and personal or national identities? Those are approaches and questions that I just cited from our BGC textbook. What first struck me is how dated Kubler's distinctions between art and utility are. Works of art are not tools, he says, although many tools may share qualities of fine designs with works of art. A work of art is as useless as a tool is useful. Works of art are as unique and irreplaceable as tools are common and expendable. End quote. Does that mean that useful objects are to be treated differently from works of art in this study of historic time? Or is there something wrong with his definition of art? Isn't art a tool to provide pleasure and joy, devotion or pride, or create commemorations or display? Anyway, definitions aside, Kubler seems to find objects, prime objects, mainly in the canon of the great artworks, and he mourns their loss quite often. But according to Kubler, prime objects do not have to be art. They could also be as simple as a draft of a crossword puzzle, with the original design being the prime object and the replicas being the printed copies once they're filled out. Other non-art makes even more sense for Kubler's concept of prime objects, I think, prime objects and replication, especially crafts and industrial design made for mass production. That seems to fit his template quite perfectly. Kubler sometimes hints at this, even identifies planned obsolescence as part of industrial design, and that would also fit very nicely to the end of his sequences. So I wonder whether he came up with the prime object idea also as a result of looking at 20th century design. It's probably much more likely that it comes out of the Nazca culture, but still, I think he's aware of that. And in 1962, this would be rather pioneering. So overall, I do not see much relevance for this book in the study of the decorative arts, or for providing any insights into Chinese art history for that matter. That's all I have. I would like to invite my colleague Aaron Glass up to the podium now.
Thanks, François. There'll be some similar sentiments. I bought this book about 30 years ago, a used copy, when I was in college, at Powells Books in Portland, Oregon. I don't think I ever read it. It did not have any of my marginalia in it, which it would have had I read it. I accepted the invitation so that I could read it, finally, after schlepping it around for 30 years. I don't even remember why I bought it, whether it was recommended to me. I probably just browsed it on the shelf at Powell's. I was studying art and anthropology and linguistics and studio art, and all the pieces were there. And I have opened it over the years. It's as you may have gathered, it's impossible to dip into this book. You don't flip to it and sort of, I've I came across the idea of prime objects and replicas. I looked at that section. I have no idea what he was talking about. And at the time, I wasn't going to start from the beginning to figure it out. So I thank you for the opportunity to read it. I'm not an art historian. I'm an anthropologist. I don't know most of the references he cites. I did look at the footnotes, but most of them, I recognize some of the authors, but few of the texts. Kroeber, yes. I'll come back to Kroeber briefly. So I have sort of less formal comments, and I thought about making some slides, but they would have all had just words on them. And so I thought I'd skip you sort of bullet point PowerPoint slides. The images were great. Meredith, that was great. François, very helpful, both of you. So my comments are sort of broken down into 4 sections. One is just my sort of experience of reading it, which I found equally compelling and confounding. I really appreciated Kubler's search for a new kind of theoretical vocabulary. It struck me as very much a product of the 1960s, a kind of a moment of sort of let's expand our ways of thinking about things. And I'll come back to that in a minute. They're sort of periodizing it. To look for a kind of non-textual methodology for understanding the history of things, for doing a kind of material culture studies, although he doesn't like that term. It's too anthropological for him. And I appreciated his sort of thinking across disciplines. I also liked his particular attempt to rethink the relationship between tradition or convention and change and invention. And some of his thoughts about that relationship are compelling. That's something that I've thought a lot about. I'm not going to detail why I found it so frustrating. Some of this was out there. It's very wandery. It's very repetitive. I found it very stream of consciousness in its sort of structure. I found a lot of this thinking very slippery, very loose. Prime objects are not like prime numbers. That's like a totally useless analogy. And in fact, by the end of the book, I was like, too many metaphors. He compares the kind of material that he's looking at or thinking about, really, rather than looking at, with math, with astronomy, with physics, with geology and mining, with biology, which sometimes means anatomy, sometimes genetics, sometimes biography of an artist. And although he sets out at the very beginning on the first page to say, I want to find a non-language-based model for understanding objects. That's not about meaning, and that's not sort of linguistically derived. And yet he has constant recourse to language to try to understand, to unpack his ideas, whether that's language understood as grammar, as semantics, as symbolism, as communication theory, crossword puzzles. So it was a frustrating but compelling read. Okay, so that's sort of thoughts number 1. 2, over the course of reading it, there were 5 sort of tensions in the book that emerged for me. And I haven't decided whether these are productive tensions or whether they're debilitating tensions, but they animated my reading of the book. So one of these is this, what I just mentioned. On the one hand, his kind of rejection of language as a model for understanding the material world, and yet constant recourse to it. Which is a tension he shares with Alfred Gell, interestingly, who I'm glad you mentioned and who I'm going to return to. Second tension, he says the book and his ideas are about forms and about form itself, but his argument is totally abstract. Every now and then he says, for example, and then he gives you one sentence, which presumes you know what he's talking about. He doesn't really apply that example to illustrate his thinking. And he's constantly returning to typologies after rejecting typological classification as a kind of method. He rejects style, but he keeps coming back to what looks a lot like style, but not with that term. Third tension. At times, I really appreciated his kind of apparently anti-elitist sort of material, big umbrella of the material world. He says this is about all human-made things, some of which are art objects, but not all. And yet there's constant recourse to very familiar value judgments about quality, about excellence, about sophistication. Part of this is in his distinction between art and craft or tools, which he maintains, even though he undermines it in interesting ways. So he recuperates the replica in a very interesting way, but still privileges the prime object. There's some tension there. Fourth tension. Some of his new sort of classifications, and much of the core of the book, the middle chapters, are him sort of offering up a different analytical vocabulary by offering new sort of classification terms. Some of them are very interesting, and some of them are kind of leveling of the material playing field. I found especially compelling statements that sort of material change is about sort of variable conditions and not about types of people in terms of what's possible. That was very compelling. And he rejects some kind of old-fashioned sort of evolutionary prejudices. And yet there is a kind of recurrent, implicit, and sometimes explicit, to my mind, sort of evolutionary assumptions that forms change from simple to complex. That's a total assumption. And there are examples that you could lay out of exactly the opposite kind of trajectory. And don't even get me started on his sort of approach to colonial encounter, or do get me started in conversation. He doesn't mention it often, and it was surprised me every time he did for somebody who was known to be, for his pre-Columbian specialization. But these kinds of assumptions about indigenous sort of capitulation to European forms and the sort of eradication of less sophisticated forms for more sophisticated forms. So, and fifth, finally, the last sort of key tension, which for me animates all of it and which Meredith has previewed, is the sort of variable role of human agency in all of this. Varies very widely across his book. Sometimes people, whether they're artists or inventors or consumers or patrons, sort of drive material change. But then he also says very explicitly that developmental change is somehow intrinsic or inherent to formal structures and sequences, to what he calls systematic ages of objects. And so I'm very interested, especially in his influence on contemporary artists and how we reconcile this sort of very variable sort of sense of the role of human agency. Okay, part 3. While I was reading it, I was trying to read it in its own time in the 1960s. Not so much historiographically. I'm not qualified to do that in terms of art history and his influences and who he influenced. He cites late Kroeber. So Kroeber was the first PhD of Franz Boas. But by the end of Kroeber's career, he became increasingly statistical in his methodology, moved away from Boasian thinking quite a lot. In his attempt to sort of operationalize cultural distributions, and in ways that are very non-Boasian. So it's sort of interesting that that had a direct influence. But then I was thinking about 4 people who he doesn't cite, but who I can't believe he wasn't thinking with. First and foremost, Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss publishes Tristes Tropiques in 1955, in French, admittedly, but he clearly reads French, and The Structural Study of Myth in English in 1955. He publishes Structural Anthropology, Volume 1 in 1958, in French, in English in 63. In 1962, same year, somehow, miraculously, Lévi-Strauss publishes both Totemism and The Savage Mind. And when Kubler talks about locating forms in structured and structural relations in a kind of grammar with other forms, rather than through kind of traditional recourse to individual creativity, it makes me think of Lévi-Strauss. Over time, objects in a series serve, as Kubler says, a kind of collective identification, a kind of self-image, pure totemism. It's exactly what Lévi-Strauss's approach to totemism is. And Kubler has his own sort of recourse to sort of binary oppositions in the sort of formulation of his concepts that struck me as very Lévi-Straussian. So I'm very interested in whether he was reading him, and if so, why he wasn't citing him, and the relationship between the German structure Forschung, which he does cite, and Lévi-Straussian structuralism. I don't know what that relationship is, but it made me interested in that. Okay, more briefly, I thought about Thomas Kuhn's Structures of Scientific Revolution, 1962, same year. when I was sort of describing Kubler's prime objects and replications to Helen Poulsen, who also works here, she said, that sounds to me like Kuhn's scientific revolutions and paradigm changes. And I was like, it does. So that's very interesting. Changes not being, again, the result of sort of individual creative breakthroughs, but a sort of structured pattern of rethinking. I was put in the mind of Arthur Danto's pivotal essay, The Art World, 1964, in which Danto talks about the category of art changing when distributed, coordinated groups of people change their minds about what art can be. And Kubler says at some point that when we reconceive the concept of art at any given time in history, it retroactively changes everything we understand about what could have been art in the past. And Danto says exactly the same thing around the same time. That was interesting. And finally, I was put in the mind of Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, also 1964. And a lot of Kubler's unpacking of his theory seems to rely on a very similar kind of understanding of communication theory that Marshall McLuhan was thinking about. Kubler talks about an equivalence of form and expression, and I'm thinking this is the medium as the message. And he talks about communication as a form of transmission. He talks about the materiality of the signal as a means of conveyance, the sender, the signal, and the receiver all being variable elements in the stability of the message that relays deform the signal. Those are all Kubler quotes, but they could be McLuhan quotes. So I'm really interested in the sort of zeitgeist question of like what was going on in the early 60s, that so many people in different kinds of realms of intellectual activity were coming to similar solutions. And finally, I read it as kind of prescient, with a question in my mind of how much direct influence was this, or how much are we just talking about similar ideas that were independently invented years later. In the wake of Levi-Strauss, Bourdieu kept coming up in my mind. At one point, Kubler actually uses the term he talks about artists' position in a sequence, and also their sort of individual artistic dispositions. And that relationship between positions and dispositions is one of Bourdieu's central theoretical formulations for thinking about the relationship between practice and structure in a really interesting way. Kubler talks about structures of routine that made me think of habitus, which Bourdieu, of course, got from Marcel Mauss, who Kubler does cite, but in a different context, not Mauss's work on habitus. So there's Bourdieu. Similarly, I was thinking about Alfred Gell and also Bruno Latour and the idea of distributed agency, that objects are only one agent in networks of agents that work together to create change in the world. I was thinking about Gell's language of prototypes and agents and patients as being very relevant, as being very parallel to some of Kubler's own articulations about the way in which objects change, but they also change the world around them as they move between people. I was thinking about Ingold's Meshworks and Ian Hodder's Entanglement, about how people and things make each other. And at one point, Kubler says very specifically, culture is not prior to material culture, in a way that struck me as very resonant with the kinds of arguments that people like Ingold and Hodder are making. And that's really his objection to the term material culture, is that it presumes culture pre-exists and material culture instantiates it. And they make the same kind of claims. Finally, and I'll end with this, in 2013, I invited my colleague Janet Berlow, who's an art historian of Native American art, to give a lecture at the BGC, right here where I'm standing. It was pre-YouTube days, so it's not recorded, it's not online. It was an essay. It was a lecture called Prime Objects of the Gods. It was about the reproduction of Navajo sand paintings in other media, mostly by non-Navajo, sometimes by Navajo. And in the lecture, which was later published as an article, which is now included in a book, which Janet is going to be here in the spring to celebrate the release of, she talked about being one of Kubler's last PhD students. And she makes this point, which is very interesting, that from Kubler, she's thought about this relationship between prime objects and replicas, but she said Kubler would have said that the original Navajo sand painting was the prime object from which all these replicas were made, these derivatives. But what Janet said was, according to Navajo cosmology, the sand painting is already a replica. It's a performance that reinstantiates something that happened or that still happens in the cosmological realm. And that the sand painting is one of a series of iterations in a transient material form that then stable material replicas were made from. And I thought that was a really interesting way to sort of think with Kubler, but to go beyond him and to say some of the vocabulary may be useful, but not necessarily in the way that he may have intended it. So, thank you. And I would now like to welcome our colleague Drew Thompson up to the microphone.
So I am going to start with an image. So as I was reading Kubler, I was particularly struck by the time period in which he was writing this book and thinking about what was happening in and around him. So when I think about the year 1961, 1962, I'm thinking about colonization and decolonization in Africa. And in many ways, the academic disciplines that I identify with and have studied from within, such as African studies, African American and African art history, or the visual studies or visual culture of the Black diaspora, they didn't formally exist within university spaces. Furthermore, I would contend that the making and studying of visual and material culture as the intellectual project that Kubler is embarking on were incredibly important for Black populations across the globe, especially at the time that he is writing this text. And so I present to you this image by the photographer Ricardo Rangel, which he later titled The Announcement of the End of Portuguese Rule in Goa and Its Reception in Mozambique. At a meta level, I think this image illustrates the ways in which processes of decolonization unfolded in advance of independence and in a place like Mozambique. It also sort of, for me, suggests that the ways and acts of looking unfolding alongside moments where a photographer feels the compulsion or need to document. So we see men who are gathering to read the text on the wall and standing behind the wall in a cafe. Ricardo Rangel is documenting this moment of this kind of encounter. And he's using, in some ways, the visual apparatus to capture something that cannot be read or something that is seen and feels a compulsion to use the visual medium to document that. So for me, the image offers a wonderful purview into the ways in which photography is unique on the African continent, the ways in which certain image-making processes are possible in Africa that might not be seen elsewhere or visible elsewhere. And in this case, there were no images, to my knowledge, of the actual invasion itself that was unfolding several thousand miles away in Goa in present-day India, that ultimately would lead to the fall of Portuguese colonial rule. And then on the African continent itself, an awareness of this event would propel other liberation movements to form and ultimately compel the Portuguese to retreat by 1975. So here exists a particular image and the ability to produce images that are particular of significance. And this kind of complexity of the relationship to the visual and the rendering of the visual is unfolding as Kubler seeks to bring new questions to the relationships between time, images, and objects that I think is compelling to think about. And I also think it's interesting that these theoretical questions are so isolated within this text when we cannot forget that the civil rights movement is happening at this time, that wars are being seen for the first time in visual images in newspapers and on television screens, and somehow this does not play into his reading or his thinking, or there's no mentioning of the outside world within this text. I was also struck about certain absences of materials. Like there's this compulsion to define, as Aaron was saying, prime objects and things. But when you look into the index of this text, you find that the objects that he defines are paintings and sculptures. There's no mentions of photography or other things of visual nature that we here at the BGC feel are of significance to our study of not only the decorative arts, but material culture and design histories. So here, as I mentioned before, televisions and photography are an essential part of the circulation of news and other informational material of the time, but photography is not mentioned here. It's treated as more a form of popular culture than an art form in and of itself. So despite these omissions, one would say, I felt myself as I was reading this text particularly sympathetic or drawn to the Disciplinary Project in some ways because it was revolutionary for the times and seeking to critique art history from outside of the discipline. It was I saw some aspects of it trying to be a disruptive force of some sort, wanting the field of art history to move beyond certain forms of writing, classifications of objects. And then at a personal level, I think the text was having me question my own consideration or my own attraction to this field of art history as a field of study, and how I found myself navigating in or around what I feel can be the discipline's own defensiveness and the elements of exclusivity or narrowness of scope of analysis. In full disclosure, I was on, and I'll take this image off the screen, I was on the receiving end I was studying art history at a moment in which Panofsky and Vasari were the text of the day. And this was, I think, in the early 2000s, and it seems as though Kubler in this moment went unacknowledged. There was no kind of mentioning of him within the art historical discipline, and there, in some ways, was a repelling force back to Panofsky. It was back to style and back to iconography as the tradition in which all good art historians should be trained. Also, in full disclosure, I went to Williams College where I studied art history, and I have to admit, when I arrived there in 2001, I had never been to the Museum of Modern Art. I had never been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I had never been to the Guggenheim. And those were kinds of, and my own cultural references at the times were photographic collections that my grandmother had from Greece and Egypt and Mexico, places I had never been at that point. And also this museum in Baltimore, which was the Black Wax Museum, which was a riff on Madame Trousseau, but told Black history through these very strange wax figures and replicas in some ways of Black history. And so for me, in this kind of context where I kind of sympathized with Kubler because I found myself retreating back to history as a discipline of study, because in some ways, history allowed me to consider art as a social practice and the roles of visual and material culture in historical events of importance. And so what I found in reading, or tried to think about as I was reading the Kubler text, was him wanting to question the art historical discipline and its relationship to history, right? That there's this term art history, but what exactly is the place of history within this kind of field of study? More recently, though, as I have watched my academic practice as a writer shift into a curatorial practice that I would argue has emerged out of the art historical discipline's compulsion for art criticism, I've come into contact with certain areas of expertise or certain areas of experience that are deemed more valid when curating exhibitions. And I think buried in this text is a harsh critique of art criticism and how it sometimes is the driver of the art historical discipline, and a questioning here, or an encouragement. And perhaps I'm thinking optimistically here, me wanting to see something to take away from this text, is that I think that perhaps in its underbelly, Kubler is trying to compel us, no matter at what periods of time that we read this text, to generate experiences and expertise that might not be visible in the traditional terminologies that we are using or thinking about. So I do share some of his skepticism of the art critic and the ability to interpret art through art criticism, which I think is buried in the text, as I said. I have to admit also here, as I was reading the text, I did not follow the instructions. I would go search for Meredith in her office and ask her what she was writing about, or I would go to Erin and say, I don't understand this. And then I went to the depths of the internet and I was like, there has to be some cliff notes for this. There has to be some way to anchor into this text. And oddly enough, I found a reference or mentioning in the most unlikely of places, which was in an article by Drew Thompson and Huey Copeland, who are two very important art historians of Africa, the diaspora, and African-American art history. And they were presenting this concept in an article called Afrotropes, a user guide, in which they actually reference Kubler and his questioning of form, and suggesting that there was a need for a more expansive thinking on form, and Kubler was the impetus for them. So what I found is that in my very own discipline that I thought might reject these ideas because of its inclusion was a reference point back in time to this earlier text, which I think suggests a certain type of solidarity or shared project, although I think Drew Thompson and Huey Copeland have a more culturally appropriate language and are more sensitive to the nuances of processes of colonization and recognize acts of decolonization. But in thinking or in being inspired to think about Kubler's text, in chapter 2, he writes, and I quote, "The shapes of time are the prey we want to capture." And I just want to repeat this line again. The shapes of time are the prey we want to capture. And as someone who has been deeply interested in histories of photography as they unfold on the continent, I was thinking about how is it that we might apply this and think about it visually as it is unfolding, and thinking about the ways in which historical actors across time and space turn to visual media and material culture to show themselves anew or to contest and debate ideas of form. And I found that very quite prevalent in my own research in Mozambique, especially when we think about how images travel over time and how meaning is made through photographs. The first photograph I show you is an attempt to use the camera to show something that would not be seen. And I think in this set of images, what I found really provocative is that there is an image from 1963 that Rangel took while walking in between news assignments. And you see this young black boy, shoeless, barefooted, standing, selling newspapers as two men dressed in suits are looking out into the street. But this photograph enters the visual or formal realm in the newspaper where the young boy is not seen. And it says, the caption says, "In my time past here are the electric cars." There's no reference to kind of the situation of colonialism. And so when I was thinking about the shapes of time, I was also thinking about how photography as a medium helps our thinking, or how the shapes of time helps me to think about photography's own representation of time, and how people in this kind of context, Rangel uses the camera both to document acts of colonialism, but also how that gets read in popular society when the image is produced or circulated. I would also add that this photograph published that I date to 1963 in this printed form, not in its halftone form, is printed only after Mozambique's independence in 1975 because of the nature of censorship and the type of erasure. So if we go back to Kubler, what I do think is interesting here is his call for a more expansive thinking about form and time, and a more grappling with, as I mentioned, this relationship to history in the art history discipline. I think more importantly, more broadly speaking, what I think is interesting here is that there is the possibility that photography as a medium of representation could be more important than sculpture or painting, right? So this thingness, or the things that Kubler thinks about, I think we have moved way beyond the narrow ways in which he has defined it. But I do think embedded in his kind of exploratory thinking is a questioning of certain art historical hierarchies and priorities, and a rethinking of the relationship of objects to time. And I think that we could benefit from thinking with these tools, even if we don't immediately identify with them. Thank you. Oh, So now I have the pleasure of introducing another convener of this event, Jeffrey Collins, and should I put up the title of the book cover for you?
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. I'm actually not making formal remarks, but while I'm speaking, I believe some chairs are going to come out. So my role is to convene a panel discussion among the speakers, but I want to start by thanking them because, as I think you get the sense of, this project that we're doing or starting today is really a massive question mark. And I'll give maybe a little more background than Josh did about how this came about. My own copy of Kubler has wandered. Is it here? That's quite all right. My own copy of Kubler was actually bought in the Yale Co-op bookstore. I do not know how many times ago, and you will notice from its pristine condition that it largely remained unread in those many decades. So it was my own frustration of never having read this text. But to the extent I did, I just thought, well, why are we not reading this at Bard Graduate Center since it starts? And I will take the opportunity of this time to read you the first paragraph of this book. Let us suppose that the idea of art can be expanded to embrace the whole range of man-made things, including all tools and writing, in addition to the useless, beautiful, and poetic things of this world. By this view, the universe of man-made things simply coincides with the history of art. It then becomes an urgent requirement to devise better ways of considering everything men have made. And I thought, well, that sounds a lot like Bard Graduate Center's project. And so where is this book in Bard Graduate Center? So anyway, I realized the first thing I need to do is to read it. And I inflicted this reading on the group of 3 very, very valiant and heroic students who were willing to read it with me last term. And our perplexities, but our excitement at the same time, are what generated this event. I was really delighted. And I have to say that the 4 colleagues have already helped me understand it a lot better. So with that, let me invite Josh back up. He'll take one stool, I'll take another. All of the speakers, please come and take a chair, and we'll have a chat. In my moderator's role, I'll just say that we have a microphone available, so I'm going to start the discussion. After about 10 minutes or so, we will open it up. If you have a question at that point, we'll ask you to raise your hand. We'll send you the mic, and we can continue the conversation in that way. I just want to thank you for elucidating, either in a very explicit way, as Aaron did, or in the substance of your remarks, tensions. And I think if there's one common thread in all of your remarks, it's that Kubler is trying something very ambitious and not always succeeding. And that many of the terms he uses are used one way in one part of the book and another way in a different part of the book, and you each brought that out. Could I ask perhaps, Meredith, since we'll come back to you since you started, having heard now your colleagues' views on this, are there any of those tensions that were resolved for you, or are there any new tensions that emerged in hearing others' questions about this interesting, perplexing, thought-provoking text?
I mean, I think I agreed with all of the tensions that my colleagues pointed out very eloquently, much more eloquently than I. For me, as I guess you might have gathered from the way I presented my reading of the text, it was really helpful to try to situate it in context. So I think
Do you mean the context of its writing in the late 50s, early 60s?
Yeah, and so I mean, I kind of went to trying to figure out who was Kubler talking to, like very directly by who he was citing. But I also really appreciate my colleagues' expansion of thinking about the time period, what's going on, the other scholars who Kubler's not citing. Sort of a deeper understanding of what style means, meant to art history at the time and now. So I guess in short, it doesn't. None of these tensions seem to be resolved for me, but I think I have a better grasp of the text as a result.
It sounds in a sense that one of the things that you are doing, that in fact all of you did, was you tried to understand Kubler's text as an intervention in a sequence, and
Yeah.
it's fairly clear that he is wanting very much to become a new prime object, and he's
Yes.
doing that by being
Yeah.
in dialogue. So on my shelf, I think one of the books that he is very much in dialogue with is Heinrich Wölfflin's Principles of Art History, the problem of the development of style in later art. And I think that would be a very productive way of sort of anchoring this text, is really thinking about what are the sequences in which he wants to intervene, what sequences does he want to break, and how is he starting or attempting to start new ones which remain linked to the previous ones in that wonderful graph that you showed us. François, are there any tensions that you detected that were helpfully resolved by what you heard tonight, or any new fissures that opened up?
Not really.
Can I push you a little bit, because I thought you highlighted one of the ones that's the most problematic for me, and maybe the most relevant for Bard Graduate Center, which is his art tool distinction, because you very accurately pulled out the places where he's seeing these entirely differently and in a sort of clumsy and crude opposition, and yet the passage that I just read begins the book by saying, well, really, we should look at these as the same thing. They're in the same class. We don't need to distinguish. And then he at times does that, but often fails to do that. So did you get any clarity on that point? Because I think if we're going to read this at Bard Graduate Center, we have to face that tension.
No, I would think that he just flips too far one way or another, as you point out.
He does say immediately after the section that I read to you that even though the aim is to enlarge it to art and tools in the same class, he says if we start from use, we will not get as far as if we start from art. So he says it and then immediately, in a sense, pulls back. So maybe a closer reading of that would be productive. Aaron, you were so explicit in your articulating and enumeration of the tensions. Did what you heard from your colleagues help with any of those?
I don't know that it helped resolve them, no. I think it helped underline their persistence. I think that all the different kinds of explications and contexts that everybody brought was very helpful. And I wonder, it struck me as the kind of text that was written later in his own career, after a lot of his own sort of more detailed studies, and had the sort of flavor of a kind of summary statement without the burden of explication.
And it bears saying that he had just finished 3 sort of path-breaking roadmap type books that do many of the things that he does not even attempt to do in this. And they have to be read together, and it's a little artificial just to read this in isolation.
It's clear, yeah. It has that sense, and I wonder whether its lack of uptake in his own field and across fields has something to do with that sort of incomplete nature of the text between its own covers, that for those who haven't read his other texts, like I haven't, you don't have the benefit of knowing how, in his own mind, these ideas are instantiated by deep scholarship in collections with sets of materials. And like I said, he drops examples occasionally, very quickly, in a sentence or two, presuming deep familiarity with those examples, and that it's obvious how they illustrate his otherwise abstract ideas, and it wasn't often for me. And so I wonder whether this is, the kind of text that in its incompleteness and the sort of lack of resolution with those sort of internal intellectual, kind of conceptual tensions, didn't undermine its own potential to be more influential
I should tell you, his other texts are illustrated. But to turn to Josh, and I saw Daniel's here and his Patty here. Anyway, these were some of the victims on whom I inflicted Kubler. When we were thinking about it and what we wanted, we simply wanted illustrations and examples. I mean, such fascinating ideas, but could you please anchor them in something concrete where we could see this done? So part of our hope in convening this event was exactly what you've provided. And give us some case studies, please. And in my own research on how Kubler has been taken up in the scholarly realm, I've begun to find them. Anyone who reads this text discovers that lack, and this was the sort of question: is what would be the case studies at Bard Graduate Center if we were to do that? Drew, you I think also highlighted in a way a crucial tension, and I'm really glad you brought it back to the sort of strange presence and absence. Kubler, when you do start that internet search, you discover that in fact he's everywhere. And yet he's nowhere, and I think it reflects perhaps some of the internal tensions that Aaron suggested. But one of the things that really motivated this project was my own surprise and confusion that Kubler he seems to be attempting to address a certain audience, and yet the audience that picked up on him was 1960s contemporary artists. Mm-hmm. And there's a very vivid love of George Kubler among the contemporary art scene, but secondarily among art historians who are studying that scene, and really he's absent in the field of anthropology, material culture as we would define it, and it was, I guess, absent at Williams College as it was in my own studies of art history. You suggested that maybe it's redeemable in some way.
Yeah, I think one thing that was really helpful after I heard everyone speak was recognizing Kubler was trying to, in some ways, disrupt art history, the hold of Vasari, the hold of Panofsky, the hold of these kind of notions of foundational text in the teaching of art history. And I think that was really important that I realized as all of you were speaking, and that he was perhaps wanting a new kind of theoretical vocabulary that would be more expansive in thinking. And so what I found really interesting then was if we are able to take him in that particular context of being disruptive within art history, then we might be able to have a better purview about what to take from it. And I think when he talks about, and it was just like going back in the notes of the conclusion, he talks a little bit about the shape of time, and then he critiques all of these disciplines like archaeology, the history of science, and then he says, art history has been reduced to a discussion of the meanings of things without much attention to their technical and formal organization. And I think what was fascinating to me was that these two scholars of African diasporic arts were referencing Kubler by ways of arguing that form has been interpreted in such narrow ways that we don't have a way of tracing it across time and space in the ways collective communities or the ways art gets taken up in social movements. And so I think I don't get his theory of time and I don't get his theory of history, but I do find it interesting that there was a way in which a contemporary scholar was referencing Kubler, and there was kind of a shared kind of quality to their respective intellectual projects.
And what you just said, you put your finger on what I've picked up as the what excited artists and critics right in the 1960s, and it was exactly, in a sense, the freeing of form from time, from rigid, deterministic, biographical ideas, and in a sense saying these forms, these sequences are available, reactivate them if they've been arrested. We can have circular time, we can have all kinds of time, and that the new vocabulary in which he expressed this was very exciting to them and is perhaps harder for us to get behind, but there's opportunity there.
Yeah, and if I could just add one more thing, I think the struggle I had with the Kubler text is that people were debating the things that he is talking about in daily life or in social practice and in social movements. And so I get a little bit frustrated with him because of that lack of acknowledgement that everyday people, everyday social movements and forms of social practice. You mentioned contemporary artists of the 60s. There was a group of Black abstractionists not too far from here where we're at in New York City who were using abstraction to disrupt the art world, right? But there's no kind of consideration of the other kinds of social contexts, or even as you were suggesting, Meredith, and the archaeological or things across time where these are happening?
So we will bring this formal panel discussion to an end and open the floor to questions and comments. We have a lot of BGC people here. We have some outsiders. Could I just start by asking, did anyone in this room, I know a few, did anyone know Kubler? Study with Kubler?
Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
I see at least two.
Who's the other person?
Marcus Burke.
Well,
Has anyone read Kubler besides us
yeah, well,
and Daniel?
I never studied with George, but I knew him very well because I guess.
Hand you the microphone.
Hello? Yeah. I knew him very well because in 1977 I was asked to do a show on Mexican colonial and Spanish art in Corpus Christi, Texas, in partnership with Linda Bantel, who later became the director of the gallery at the Pennsylvania Academy. And it was way early to be doing something like that. And of course, Kubler's book with Martin Soria's book had just come out in '59 and was sort of what you had. And so I went up to New Haven and just threw myself on his mercy. And I found him to be enormously generous and kind and friendly and wanting this project to succeed, as you expect. I just want to footnote that later I used Martin Soria's papers that George Kubler, who must have been very, very close with Martin Soria, organized after Soria died, and they're in the Yale Library. And if you're doing any work on either peninsular or New World Hispanic culture, they are a real gold mine. But the idea of doing that, of arraying all those things in a sequence, is sort of here. I've been teaching out of this book, I just counted, for about 45 years. And I started with graduate students and advanced undergraduates in Nacogdoches, Texas, at Stephen F. Austin State University. And that was bookended with teaching graduate students in both the Fine Arts Department and the Graduate School of Design at Yale. And that was in the early 90s.
And you told me in an email that you've taught it here at Bard Graduate Center, which I did not know.
I'll get back. I picked up the book just to have the book, and then I realized this is the very book I put on reserve here. I started at Cooper Hewitt using it. But the reason my colleagues, artists on this art faculty, I was the only art historian, wanted it is because the students wanted it. And from the late 60s, and maybe earlier really, you'd think of some of the abstract expressionists, and even earlier in modernism, but into the 1990s, young artists were really interested in mathematics as metaphors that could push their art. The golden rectangle expressed as the Fibonacci series that kept coming up constantly. So the mathematical metaphors in this salad bowl of metaphors that the book offers were very interesting. I took to art history with this later when I realized that from the very first page to almost the last page, I'm sorry, when you were talking about the African American scholars, that was almost the last page you read in the book. From one end to the other, it is massively, determinedly, aggressively object-centered. And so when...
I'm not convinced.
I don't see any objects here, but I know they're all over this building and in all the books in this building. And so when applied to the study of the history of the arts of design, it is very interesting to see what was really the first megaton bomb in the application of theoretical meta-history to art history to be so simultaneously object-centered. So here you had both, but you had to fillet it for anybody to use it, right? You couldn't just throw this at students. And out of that object-centeredness comes this wonderful idea of objects as having both self-signals and adherent signals. And they're the hammer and the Meissen figurine work as well as the Kouros and the Kritios boy and so forth. Do you see what I'm saying? But you know, it was interesting listening to you that you talked about the sequences, which obviously, but that's only half the metaphor from mathematics. The other half is the concept of a limited sequence, a sequence which is a series heading towards a limit. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, getting finer and finer and finer. Have any of you seen the NOVA? That they just put out the NOVA program on zero and infinity and sequences and series and ultimately calculus. It was like they'd been reading Kubler. And at one point, the man shoots an arrow and they freeze it in time. And they talk about that object in time and, of course, the mathematical problems of how you can specify it and so forth, uncertainty theorem and everything. And really, zeitgeist, that was great. That was so great. But it was astonishing how he was plugged into the age. And these were simultaneous publications. These were people in parallel tracks, right? And wow, there it was, frozen on the PBS TV screen. The flashes between the lighthouse, all those things he talks about. But the thing that the artists and also the art historians really got into as I taught them was the series getting more and more and more into replication. And the wonderful word from Göhler it is, all these umlauts, Göhler, right? Form and Müderung. When I first read this and taught it on television, Geritol, which was an iron tonic that you were to take to avoid iron deficiency anemia or tired blood. Well, form and Müderung is tired form. And at some point he says, the artists start to get bored. And that's within it. Or something happens to slap them out of it. And a new series starts, maybe within the sequence.
Thank God, I think none of us are bored, but I know we
Well,
want to
anyway,
continue this.
so
I know we want to continue
those
the
are the things
discussion.
I've found useful, that double mathematical metaphor and the idea of objects as having these agencies because they have self-signals and programmed into them adherence signals. So I'm done.
We have to leave it there because of time, I'm afraid.
No.
But we invite you all to join us upstairs on the 6th floor to continue the conversation.
Can I say something before you all disperse?
I'd prefer if we could do it upstairs. Are you able to come upstairs with us?
I am, but it take me 3 seconds, and I think you lose
3
it.
seconds.
Can I have the microphone, or I stand up and speak? You can hear me.
Philip,
Oh, okay. Oh.
please, we have to keep it brief so we can
Yeah,
continue
this
upstairs.
will be extremely brief. Briefly, I came to Yale as a graduate student in 1961. I had George Kubler for a pre-Columbian course in 1963. He was an excellent teacher, but I have to say, he was also known for having his head in the clouds a lot of the time. As to this evening's talk, I have 3 things I wanted to mention. The first is, and they're all contextual. The first is where George Kubler went to school and what he studied. He studied with Henri Faucillon
The Life of
in
Forms and
France.
Art.
And his famous book was the Levy de Form, The Life of Form. So there was this dialectic dispute between the Panofsky side and the formal side. And I think that Kubler's book is an attempt to carry on the Faucillon tradition in modern terms. That's historical. The second 2 points are his interest in whatever he's written about in this book manifested itself in his graduate students and in his program there. As far as I understand it, Bob Thompson, was his graduate student and the first person who was authorized to study the history of African art as an academic discipline. So George basically brought the world of African art into the world of art history. I think he did this, I'm not sure about this, but I think he did the same things with pre-Columbian studies. So this business of what's theoretically here, I think manifested in his academic work through his students and opening up the field. And I don't know enough to know how that carries over into what you all are studying here as material culture, but somehow I see it as a grandfathering of what has come down. So maybe he wasn't able to articulate it in a better form, but I think there's some benefit to what he was trying to do that is in some weird way expressed through this book that he wrote.
Thank you very much. The question looming over this event was, should we read Kubler? I think we've answered in the affirmative. And we can continue that conversation upstairs with some refreshments. So please join us in thanking the panelists, and please join us upstairs on the 6th floor.